and how to treat the complications also in very short manner. Coming to the chronic complications of diabetes, complications may present in around 20 to 50% of patients at diagnosis. So the most common type of diabetes is type 2 diabetes generally, and in type 2 diabetes, generally patients present with complications itself. That means the patient had developed diabetes like around 5 years or 10 years or 15 years back itself, but he won't recognize that. He won't be checking his fasting levels, or he won't be checking the random blood glucose levels, and he won't have any symptoms. And he will present into the medicine OPD only after developing complications. That is neuropathy, nephropathy, and I'll be telling you. So in India, presently, diabetic patients presenting with complications directly are around 20 to 50%. This is very bad actually. That's why nowadays annual screening above the people who are above age of 40, 45, annual or 6 month screening of RBS has to be done, irrespective they have symptoms or not, to avoid these complications. Once this, because I told you, if you diagnose diabetes in early stages, it is reversible. Except type 1, all those are reversible. But once these complications are developed, it is an irreversible stage. Just you can control the further progression, you can control it, but whatever damage has occurred is already there. So annual screening of sugars, annual screening for sugars, irrespective of symptoms, has to be there for elderly people age above 40. And nowadays, actually, for people above 20 also, it has to be done once in a year, because a lot of cases are being diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 25 and 30 also nowadays. So this is one important thing. And what is the mechanism of development of these chronic complications? I won't go into details of this pathophysiology totally, just the names, just for you to have an idea. Because of this increased hyperglycemia, and increased glucose levels, there is formation of increased advanced glycation end products. Glycation end products are nothing but these high glucose levels starts attaching or starts bonding with some products like albumin, hemoglobin, all those things, and that combined product is called as glycation end product, and these are harmful. And these products goes into some series of steps and causes oxidative stress to the body, because of which complications will be developed. So just remember, increased amount of advanced glycation products is one mechanism of development of complications. Second is increased polyol pathway. You know from your biochemistry, polyol pathway is all these, your glucose gets converted to sorbitol with the help of enzyme aldose reductase, and that is called as polyol pathway. That is normally also there in our human body. But when the glucose levels are very high, body, to decrease this glucose levels, all this shunts all this glucose into sorbitol. But this increased sorbitol leads to development of this complication. So sorbitol, increased levels of sorbitol in the body is not good for health. So increased sorbitol via aldose reductase, that is polyol pathway. Because of this pathway also, complications are safe. And there are some these are rare things. These two are main important things. And recent studies have shown that there are factors like transforming growth factor beta, development. Vascular endothelial growth factor A is responsible for proliferative activation. Formation. Actually, the beta, VGF, all those complications will mechanism of complications are there. Just a minute, 1 minute. Mechanism, these two are the main mechanisms, and if you see what are the complications are, microvascular complications are nephropathy, neuropathy, and retinopathy. Macrovascular complications are coronary artery disease, that is heart, coronary arteries involvement, cerebrovascular disease, that is related to stroke and severe strokes, and peripheral arterial disease, and there are some miscellaneous complications also. So I'll be dealing about these three. These three things are mainly, and micro and macrovascular complications mainly in detail, and some miscellaneous also. So if you come to the miscellaneous complications of diabetes, they are mainly gastrointestinal involvement leads to gastroparesis and diarrhea. GI involvement, that is mainly autonomic neuropathy. Basically, the neuropathy nerve system of your GI system leads to this gastroparesis and diarrhea. Genitourinary system leads to uropathy and sexual dysfunction, mainly erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, these type of features, and these two are also autonomic dysfunction only. Dermatological manifestations, I have a slide on this dermatologic manifestation separately. Some characteristic findings are there in this. I'll tell about that. And infectious complications, I'll tell about that in later slides. Ophthalm-related complications are cataract and glaucoma. Glaucoma is mainly open-angle glaucoma. You came from your part one just now, and you might be knowing this. And type of cataract in diabetes is anyone? It's a live session. We can ask questions. Okay. Cataract mainly it is snowflake cataract. Snowflake cataract is the most common seen in diabetes. Glaucoma is open angle glaucoma, and sometimes cheiroarthropathy is also seen. Cheiroarthropathy is nothing but thickened skin and reduced joint mobility will be there. That's also complication. Periodontal disease, hearing loss, these are rare complications. So infectious complications, dermatological complications, and autonomic complications involving gastrointestinal, genitourinary, and ophthalmic complications. These are all seen as miscellaneous complications. And and coming to the each complication in brief ones, nephropathy. Risk factors for development of nephropathy. Main risk factor is family history of diabetic nephropathy. So genetic component is more involved in development of nephropathy rather than neuropathy and other things, which I'll be telling later. Genetic factor is more involved. So if a patient has family history of diabetic nephropathy, his father has of him developing nephropathy is very high. And smoking, underlying smoking history also aggravates the chance of developing nephropathy. If you see the natural history, how these nephropathy develops over a period of time in diabetic patients, in the first 5 years of development of diabetes, it's not first 5 years of diagnosing patient, it's first 5 years of developing diabetes. The patient has hyperglycemia in the body. In the first 5 years, what happens is there will be glomerular hyperfiltration will be there, and there will be increased GFR. This is something odd. This can be sometimes your questions and need. That's why I'm going in detail. Generally, in diabetes, in the end stage, GFR decreases. If you calculate, creatinine will go high and GFR decreases. But actually, in the initial first 5 years, there will be increased GFR because of the some unknown pathological mechanisms. GFR will be increased, so the kidney is working more. Because of this increased work for around 5 years, later in the first 5 to 10 years, some nephrons die and they won't work, and because of which the patients start developing microalbuminuria. That is, in the first 5 to 10 years, microalbuminuria is seen. So in the first 5 years, there is no symptoms. Even if you check urine also, nothing will be there. After 5 years only, microalbuminuria is seen. What is microalbuminuria? 30 to 300 milligrams of protein if it is being passed in urine for 24 hours. So 30 to 299 mg per day in 24-hour urine collection. If that so much amount of proteins are seen in urine, it is diagnosed as microalbuminuria. Or else in spot urine, in spot sample, if you see, for this you need to collect urine for 24 hours and then measure it. In spot sample, if you want to measure, same value, 30 to 300 micrograms per mg of creatinine. With compared to creatinine, you have to measure this. Micrograms of per mg of creatinine, if it is there also, it indicates microalbuminuria. That is 30 to 300. This value is important. And less than that is normal. Like some patients, even in normally also can have proteinuria, that will be very minimal, less than that. If it is greater than 300, then it is called as macroalbuminuria. That is seen after 10 years. 10 to 20 years, then the patient start having macroalbuminuria. After 20 years, then the patient goes into end-stage renal disease with GFR of less than 15 and going for dialysis and all those things. This is the natural history. If you for this, hyperglycemia is a common symptom. Like in these first 5 years, hyperglycemia is there, and in the next 10 years, microalbuminuria is there, and still hyperglycemia is continuing. Then they'll go into macroalbuminuria, and then they'll go into ESR. So if you halt hyperglycemia at any stage, then this process can be halted. So that is the reason, importance of knowing this natural history. So first 5 years, there will be glomerular hyperfiltration, increased GFR will be there. So that's what measures to halt nephropathy progression. I told you the progression. What are the measures you have to do? First thing is glucose control. Adequate glucose control has to be there. And second is hypertension control, and the target is 130/80. This is important. Generally nowadays the target of high BP you will consider it as 140/90, 150/90 elderly patients and all. But in nephropathic patients, diabetic patients with nephropathy, diagnosed nephropathy, hypertension control should be very strict, and the target should be less than 130/80, not even more than 130. It should be less than 130/80. Then only the progression can be halted. And lipid profile control has to be done for these patients also, because nephropathy, one more thing is it's more related to atherosclerotic vascular disease. Atherosclerotic vascular disease is more common in these nephropathic patients. That's why lipid profile has to be checked, and if it is abnormal, that has to be controlled. Then the progression can be halted. And administration of AC inhibitors and ARBs, angiotensin receptor blockers, which decrease proteinuria and then halt the progression. Protein intake wise, food intake wise, if a patient comes to you and he was diagnosed with diabetes and the urological or nephrological examination showed microalbuminuria, then the protein intake for him should, apart from control of all these things, protein intake should be in the range of 0.8 to 1 gram per kg per day in this range, and for macroalbuminuria it should be less than 0.8 gram per kg per day. This is because excessive protein intake can cause renal failure, can cause nephropathy, because all the proteins has to be excreted, so that causes a burden. So that's why protein intake should be less. And as I told you, atherosclerosis is very common in nephropathic patients, and in fact, this is the leading cause of death in diabetic nephropathy. So a patient has diabetes and diabetic nephropathy and ESRD, end-stage renal disease is there, and is on dialysis. That patient generally won't die with CKD. He won't die because of CKD. He will die because of your MI, cardiovascular disease, MI, STEMI, and all those things because of those. So atherosclerosis is very important feature of nephropathy, and that has to be controlled by lipid profile control, glucose control, all these things. And since these patients also have autonomic neuropathy, during dialysis chances of hypotension are also more. So if you go to this stage, generally the survival is very, prognosis is very bad, and the mortality is very high. So better to prevent rather than cure. This is about nephropathy. Next is neuropathy. And what are the risk factors for neuropathy? Most important is duration of diabetes, how long the diabetes has been there in the body, and glycemic control, and how high are the sugars. Is it moderately elevated sugars, or very high sugars? That also determines neuropathy. Along with consumption of alcohol, smoking, BMI, is the patient obese. If the patient is obese, chances of developing neuropathy are more, and dyslipidemia, mainly hypertriglyceridemia. So these are all risk factors. Patient has diabetes, and these risk factors are there. Chances of developing neuropathy are very high. You should be alert in that. So when a patient comes to diabetes with you, and you have to evaluate for all these risk factors also. If anything is there, then you have to look forward for neuropathy changes. How you look forward is by assessment by 128 Hz tuning fork. Tuning fork 128 Hz will be using it. 512 Hz will be using for your ENT causes, Rennes test, Weber's test, and all. 512 will be using. Here will be using 128 Hz, and with that you have to check it. Even though the patient may not be symptomatic, on examination you can pick sometimes. Then you can. There are. This is again a separate big topic. How to prevent neuropathy and all. There are some procedures. There are some methods like wearing chappals, wearing socks, and all those protective things, so that in initial stages neuropathy can be prevented. So assessment is being given risk factors, and most common form of neuropathy is distal symmetrical sensory polyneuropathy, which begins in the feet. This is the most common form of neuropathy. Just remember this, DSPN, distal symmetrical sensory polyneuropathy. And when you call this acute and chronic neuropathy, if the symptoms are there for less than 12 months, it is called as acute. The symptoms are persisting for more than 12 months, it is called as chronic. And other types of neuropathy, diabetes just not only causes DSPN, and it also causes other rare types of neuropathy also. There are diabetic amyotrophy, where the hip extensors are involved, exclusively hip extensors are involved, and it's called as diabetic amyotrophy. And diabetic polyradiculopathy, which is self-limited generally, that is involvement of multiple polyradicals can be there, but generally this is self-limited. Mononeuropathy, that is involvement of only one nerve, can also be seen. And in this, the most common nerve involved is third cranial nerve, is the most common to be involved. and these present with diplopia and ptosis with normal pupillary response. This is again important. Ptosis with normal diplopia with normal pupillary response is diabetes. Diplopia and ptosis with abnormal pupillary response are basically surgical causes. Medical causes, pupillary response will be normal. Surgical causes, pupillary response will be abnormal. This is again a separate, mostly they'll be discussing in your neuro CNS classes. So mononeuropathy is there. Autonomic neuropathy, I told you already. Autonomic neuropathy involving CVS can be seen, that is they can develop orthostatic hypotension when the CVS is involved. CVS autonomic nervous system is involved. When the genitourinary system is involved, it leads to cystopathy and erectile dysfunction. When the gastrointestinal system is involved, it leads to gastroparesis, enteropathy, diarrhea, all those things. So treatment, how do you treat this chronic painful neuropathy? And this neuropathy is painful because of small fiber involvement. So main treatment is tricyclic antidepressants, amitriptyline and nortriptyline has to be given. And sometimes SNRIs, duloxetine, that is selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. This is a bit actually serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, that is duloxetine, can also be given for treating this. And sometimes anticonvulsants like gabapentin, pregabalin, carbamazepine, phenytoin, all this can also be given. Pregabalin is the most commonly used one in this segment, and amitriptyline, nortriptyline can also be used. So this is the treatment of chronic painful neuropathy. And I told you already, orthostatic hypotension when CVS is involved, and how to treat this is basically increased salt intake has to be taken. You know what is orthostatic hypotension? Like whenever patient stands from sitting position or sleeping position, suddenly there will be loss of blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure by greater than 20 mmHg and diastolic by greater than 10 mmHg is called as orthostatic hypotension, because of which he has giddiness and he has to sit for some time and then only he can wake up. This is basically because of autonomic neuropathy. And how to treat them is adequate salt intake has to be given, dehydration has to be prevented, diuretics, which decrease load, has to be stopped, fludrocortisone, which is a steroid, mineralocorticoid, has to be given, midodrine, clonidine, octreotide, these drugs can also be given to increase blood pressure. So this is about nephropathy and neuropathy, and now it's retinopathy last. What are the risk factors for retinopathy development? Is duration of diabetes, again same thing, degree of glycemic control and hypertension and genetic susceptibility. Genetic susceptibility is also there for retinopathy. So seeing these three complications, genetic susceptibility is more involved in nephropathy. Nephropathy has more genetic susceptibility, followed by retinopathy and followed by neuropathy. This is a pattern. And in diabetes can cause non-proliferative type of retinopathy. It can cause proliferative retinopathy and it can cause macular edema. These are the three types generally. And non-proliferative retinopathy presents with vascular microaneurysms, hot and blot hemorrhages, cotton wool spots. This is all you might be learned in ophthalmology just last year. So these are the non-proliferative retinopathic changes. Proliferative retinopathic changes presents as IRMA generally, that is intraretinal microvascular anomalies, IRMA, and you have this classification of this also. And next is macular edema, and the cause of blindness in these patients, the most devastating complication of retinopathy is it can cause blindness, complete blindness of the patient, and the most common reasons for blindness in diabetic patients is proliferative diabetic retinopathy and macular edema. These are the main causes of retinopathy. So that's why this has to be taken care of, and patients should not go into develop into these complications. Once the proliferative retinopathy is there, then treatment is by pan-retinal photocoagulation will be done. For macular edema, focal laser photocoagulation will be done. And aspirin has no benefit in retinopathy progression. AC inhibitors has benefit in stopping this one, but aspirin has no benefit in this progression. And if patient has advanced eye disease with lot of proliferative and non-proliferative retinopathy, then general ophthalmologists advise to restrict the physical activity, and they should not involve in valsa or maneuvers and all, because that will raise the intraocular pressure and again hemorrhage can happen. So just remember, duration, degree of control and susceptibility is one risk factor, and types of retinopathy, non-proliferative, proliferative macular edema, and how you treat that. That is about retinopathy. Next, how do you screen these complications? We have studied about the complications, how it will all. So how do you screen it? See, with regard to screening, the logic for everything is same. All the retinopathy, neuropathy, and nephropathy screening has to be done at the time of diagnosis in type 2 diabetic patients, and 5 years of diagnosis in 5 years after the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes mellitus. The logic behind this is same. I told you already, diabetes mellitus, type 2 diabetes mellitus, they won't present to the medical OPD soon after they have high sugars in the blood. They present only after developing complications or after a long time. They had diabetes like from 4 years back. They have started hyperglycemia in their bodies there, but they didn't recognize it. And after 5 years, after 10 years only, they'll come to the OPD with some complications. But in type 1 diabetes mellitus, that is not the picture, because in type 1, generally there is absolute insulin deficiency and the sugars are very high. Within 6 months to 1 year of hyperglycemia only, they'll present to department with your classical symptoms of polyuria, polydipsia, these weight loss. These are the classical, which we normally describe for diabetes symptoms, are all mostly for type 1. Polyuria, polydipsia, weight loss, all these symptoms can be seen within 6 months to 1 year itself. So in type 1 diabetics, they present early and the complications are not there in them at the time of presentation. In type 2, they present with complications. So that's why we don't know. Whenever a type 2 diabetic patient comes, we don't know the complications are there or not there. That's why immediately you have to do this screening. Retinopathy screening, neuropathy, and nephropathy screening has to be done. But if a type 1 diabetic patient comes, you can just wait for 5 years, and after 5 years, control the sugars for 5 years, and then can just look for neuropathy and retinopathy screening. Screening and all I told you already. Just you have to go for fundus examination. For neuropathy screening, you have to go examine with 128 Hz scope, and nephropathy you have to check for microalbumin, and microalbumin levels you have to check it. This is the regarding screening part. Type 1 after 5 years of diagnosis, type 2 at the time of diagnosis. This is important. This is all about microvascular complications: retinopathy, neuropathy, nephropathy. Next is the macrovascular complications. That is mainly CVS, cardiovascular system. Yeah, I'll go a little bit fast. First, time may not be sufficient. So, mainly involving cardiovascular disease. So these patients will have symptoms of ischemia. All these things will be there, and the main thing is all these things. I think they will be treated, discussing in your cardio class and neuro classes mainly. So, what I want to emphasize more here is if the patient has diabetes and cardiovascular system involvement is there, and patient had an MI or any STEMI, all these complications or anything had happened, then aspirin is generally indicated. Antiplatelets will be started soon after patient has this one. But if the patient has diabetes and there are increased coronary vascular disease risk factors, what are they? They are like hypertension, coexistence of diabetes with hypertension, smoking, if the patient is a smoker, and there is family history of ischemic heart disease, his father has ischemic heart disease, or the patient has complications like albuminuria, dyslipidemia. If any one of these is present along with diabetes means, then aspirin has to be started as a primary preventive measure. So even if there are no cardiac symptoms, even if the patient doesn't have any cardiac related problem or didn't have any chest pain, didn't have any MI or anything, as a sort of primary prevention, you have to start aspirin. This is actually important. A lot of your relatives might be diabetic, they might be having this coefficient risk factors, but they might not be on aspirins. But as per recent things, they have to be started. And if there is low risk for CSD, that is patient is only diabetic and he doesn't have any of these risk factors, so there is no need to start, no obedience to start aspirin. But if there is risk factors, you have to start. And lower extremity complications, that is nothing but peripheral arterial disease. And 15% of the diabetic patients develop with ulcers. That is 15% of the patients will have peripheral arterial disease as a complication. And the site of ulcer development is important. It is either grade 2, most common sites are grade 2, metatarsophalangeal joint, and tarsometatarsal joint. These three are the most common sites of ulcer development in diabetic patients because of peripheral vascular disease. And what are the risk factors which are more common to go into this one is again when more diabetes of greater than 10 years, underlying neuropathy, bone deformity, smoking, all these are same. Poor glycemic control will be there for all. Whenever a patient comes with this one, you have to just look for any bony involvement. Ulcer will be there. Sometimes this ulcer at the bed of the ulcer it can involve bone also. So bony involvement has to be checked. So for that, MRI foot is generally advised to look for severity and all. So this is about macrovascular complications. So macro, I am not going into much detail because that will be dealt with respective subjects. Next is dermatological manifestations of diabetes. This is a little bit specific things are there. Just a short note on that. What are the manifestations? What are the dermatological manifestations? Are mainly vitiligo, acanthosis nigricans, granuloma annulare, and diabetic dermopathy. That is pigmented pretibial papules (PPP). Diabetic, it's called as diabetic dermopathy. In the pretibial region, pigmented papules are there. So these are the classical dermatological manifestations of diabetes. Generally, they are not seen. Acanthosis nigricans is seen. This diabetic dermopathy is very classical for this one. So this four, and the fifth one is necrobiosis lipoidica diabeticorum. There is one manifestation called this one, necrobiosis lipoidica diabeticorum. It is seen most commonly in young women with type 1 diabetes mainly, and it is what it has is the features are it has painful erythematous blocks in the pretibial region with central ulceration and atrophic center. So centrally there will be ulceration, and peripherally there will be erythematous blocks will be there. That is most site is pretibial region again. Yes. And if you biopsy this, there will be necrobiosis of collagen and obliterative endarteritis. So basically endarteritis, totally vascular supply is lost, and then there will be necrosis of the collagen. So necrobiosis of collagen and obliterative endarteritis. So that's why the name necrobiosis lipoidica diabeticorum is there. It is also very classical of diabetes, diabetic patient, diabetic complication. So diabetic dermopathy and necrobiosis lipoidica are very classical for the sugar patients. And infective complications, these patients are more prone for to develop some infections like rhinocerebral mucormycosis. You might be hearing more about this mucormycosis, all ophthalmic involvement, TNT involvement because of this present COVID era. So there is high sugars, steroids causing high sugars, causing developing this complication. So high sugars are very important for this one. Basically, mucor is basically an opportunistic infection. It is not. It's a common cell. It is normal also there in our body. But if the sugars are very high for long periods, then these complications can be there. Similarly, other infections include emphysematous cholecystitis, emphysematous pyelonephritis, and malignant otitis externa. These are the other dermatological or infective complications of diabetes. Just a short note on dyslipidemia. Diabetes causes dyslipidemia, and the most common type of dyslipidemia seen in these patients is low high density lipoprotein and high triglycerides. This is the pattern of dyslipidemia seen in diabetic patients: high triglycerides and low HDL. And you have to treat it. I told you already, dyslipidemia and all those things have to be treated to prevent the progression or prevent the further progression of the disease. So what should be given priority? First priority is to lower LDL levels. Generally, LDL will not be high as per se because of diabetes, but there are some underlying problems and a lot of other things will be there. So if the LDL is also high, first preference has to be given to lowering LDL levels. Next is increasing HDL levels, and the last is lowering triglyceride levels. In diabetic patients, this has to be the priority, and this will differ from case to case, like diagnosis to diagnosis. In diabetic patients, this is the scenario. HMG coenzyme. So for this, the drug of choice for lowering LDL is statins. So HMG coenzyme reductase inhibitors. That's nothing but statins. Rosuvastatin, atorvastatin, simvastatin, all those things will be given to lower this LDL levels. And to increase HDL levels, will be drugs used are pioglitazone, pitavastatin, Weight loss can also cause increase HDL levels, and walnut intake can cause increased HDL levels. So this is about short note on dyslipidemia, pattern of dyslipidemia seen in diabetics, and what has to be given importance. And what are the target levels in dyslipidemia in different scenarios? I'll tell you. So there is diabetic with age greater than 40 years, elderly age diabetic, and there are no CVD risk factors. CVD is cardiovascular disease risk factors. What are the, I told you already: smoking, hypertension, uh, smoking, hypertension, alcohol consumption, these things, and nephropathy, microvascular complications, these things. If nothing of the complication is there, then the target LDL will be less than 100, HDL will be greater than 14 men and 15 females, and triglycerides will be less than 1. This is the target. This is sufficient for us. But in an elderly diabetic with patient having CHD risk factors, coronary heart disease, risk factors are there, then add statin regardless of LDL level. Whatever the LDL level is, you have to add statin. This is important again. So elderly diabetics greater than 40 years with risk factors like hypertension, smoking, alcohol, whatever, all those things I mentioned in the previous slide, they have to be started on antiplatelets, aspirin, and statin irrespective of symptoms. So primary prevention wise, antiplatelet and statin has to be started in elderly diabetic with coronary heart disease or coronary heart disease risk factors. This is very important, and it shows that if you are starting on primary prevention, the risk is very less. So in these, actually LDL goal is less than 70, and these are the complications. Again, same thing, risk factors I have mentioned: dyslipidemia, hypertension, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, smoking, microalbuminuria, macroalbuminuria. These are the risk factors you have to look for. And in post IHD patients, that is, patients had ischemic heart disease and had a stent, PTC and CABG, LDL target is less than 55. So these are the various targets, 55, 70, and 100. With regard to hypertension, again, what are the target hypertension levels in diabetic patients? Normally, in diabetic patients, target BP is less than 140/90 is sufficient. But in nephropathy patients, I told you already, accurate, very exact BP control is required. So target here is 130/80, less than 130/80. And in elderly patients with diabetes, 60 years of age, 150/90 is sufficient, because as the age progresses, if you they have very accurate hypertension control, they may go into hypotension and die. That is one complication in elderly patients. So above elderly patients, the target is 150/90. Just 150/90 or less than that is sufficient, because their lifespan is not going to there much. But in patients with nephropathy, 130/80, and in young patients generally is 140/90. So I told you already, ACE inhibitors and ARBs has to be given importance as antihypertensive medication, because apart from antihypertensive effect, they slow the progression of diabetic renal disease. So that's why ACE and ARBs are the first drugs of hypertension management in diabetics. Next, other drugs are prazosin, CCBs, beta blockers, and all those things. They can be given. If you go in detail, again, beta blockers and thiazides, diuretics, they increase insulin resistance, and so because of it, again, diabetes will be there. So diabetic with hypertension, better avoid diuretics and beta blockers first. Start with ACE and ARB inhibitors. If it is not in control, you can go for calcium channel blockers, prazosin, and then finally, if you want, you can do it. First is ACE inhibitors, and second drug is CCBs. So this is about complications, chronic complications, microvascular, macrovascular, and how to do, and dyslipidemia component, what are the targets and how to do and all. Next, we'll go to the management of diabetes. Before going to the management, first we'll see the targets. What are our targets for treating diabetes? HbA1c should be less than 7. PPBS should be in the range of 180 to 130. Sorry, postprandial, preprandial should be in the range of 80 to 130. And postprandial should be in the range of less than 180. and BP should be less than 140/90 in general. So these are our targets when we are treating diabetic patients. Just remember these targets, these are important, 80 to 130 and less than 180. This is a tabular column from Harrison only. This is as per greatest guidelines. So management of type 2 diabetes, flowchart of management of type 2 diabetes. In this already I have discussed some. First thing is individualized glycemic control. That is glucose control has to be done. That has to be individualized according to the patient basis. And again it has three components: diet or lifestyle modifications, and exercise, daily exercise, and medication. Medication is oral hypoglycemic drugs and insulin. And diet and exercise we know already. Diet is nothing but they have to consume more of Mediterranean diet. That is diet rich in vegetables, fruits, low fat and high protein diet has to be taken. And the fat should contain more of monounsaturated fatty acids. So low fat, low carb and high protein diet has to be taken, rich in vegetables and fruits with more of vitamins and minerals. And in that also fat, more of monounsaturated fatty acids should be there. That is regarding to diet. Exercise daily 30 minutes of aerobic exercise has to be done for at least 5 days in a week. So 30 days per day, 30 minutes per day for 5 days has to be done. Aerobic physical activity like in the form of just jogging or walking, etc., has to be done. First, this has to be tried for glucose control. If it is not sufficient, then you have to go for medication. And treat associated. So once you are done with glucose control, then you have to treat associated conditions. What are the associated conditions? Like dyslipidemia, hypertension, obesity. I told you already. Dyslipidemia, how to treat, what are the targets, and hypertension also I told you. And obesity is again separate factor, separate topic, and we'll be dealing it later. So these things also are treated. And then you have to also screen for complications and also manage the complications like retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, cardiovascular, miscellaneous. These things also I told you, chronic complication of and all. So now we'll go to the glycemic control, how to do and all. These are the flowchart showing the oral drugs and insulin, like IV parenteral drugs for diabetes. This flowchart is not so clear, but these drugs are already there in the next thing also. Just to summarize, you might be knowing this flowchart from your pharmacology, OHA drugs. So two types will be there: anti-hypoglycemic agents, oral and parenteral. Oral again act by many mechanisms. Main difference should be other mechanisms or many drugs are there, but oral drugs which act by releasing insulin, they're called as insulin secretagogues. They're also called as, so they act by insulin release. They are sulfonylureas and meglitinates, two classes of drugs. Meglitinates like repaglinate, nateglinate. Sulfonylureas are first generation, second generation. First generation is chlorpropamide and tolbutamide. These are obsolete now, not in use. Second generation glipizide, glitazide, glibenclamide. I'll be telling all this next slide. So these act by insulin release. So the most important complication of these drugs is hypoglycemia. Because insulin is released, normally from our beta cells, insulin is released based on the glucose regulated insulin uptake. Insulin is released, I told you in the first class. But here we are giving external drugs and insulin is being released. So that's why hypoglycemia is one important complication of these drugs. And these drugs won't have any hypoglycemia, only these two sectors, sulfonylureas and meglitinates, have hypoglycemia. And other drugs are bigonides, thiazolidines. I'll tell about these drugs and examples of these drugs in the next slide. Parenteral drugs are insulin. There are many types of insulins. I'll be telling it later. And GLP analogs, that is, examples include exenatide and liraglutide. These are given parenterally. And amylin analogs, that is pramlintide. These are given. Just we'll have a brief discussion of all these drugs now. Just mechanism of what are the class of drugs, examples of the drug, how they act, and what are the main advantages and disadvantages. First is the bigonides. The oral hypoglycemic drug of choice for diabetic patients is bigonides, that is metformin. Example of this class is metformin, and they act by decreasing hepatic glucose production. This is the main mechanism of action. No need to remember this HbA1c reduction and all. Just know the mechanism and some advantages and disadvantages. If you go with metformin, it is weight neutral. It doesn't increase weight or doesn't decrease weight, and it do not cause hypoglycemia. I told you, except your sulfonylureas and meglitinides, none of the other drug causes hypoglycemia. And it is very inexpensive and cheap drug, and most first use drug for this one. Main disadvantage of metformin is vitamin B12 deficiency. This is important. So metformin causes vitamin B12 deficiency. Normally, only our Indians are more prone to develop vitamin B12 deficiency. So always, if you are any of your parents or relatives or anyone is on metformin for a long time, keep checking vitamin B12 levels. So vitamin B12 deficiency is more common, and they can also have lactic acidosis, diarrhea, etc. And when you should not use this drug is when there is renal insufficiency, that is GFR of less than 45. If it's not like creatinine once is high, it's 1.8, creatinine is 1.8 or 2, then you should not give metformin. No, you have to calculate GFR basically. If the creatinine is high, you have to calculate the GFR, and that GFR, if it is less than 45 only, metformin is contraindicated, should not be given, or whenever there is acidosis also it should not be given. So this is about metformin. Next come the next class of drugs are alpha glucosidase inhibitors. Examples are acarbose, meglitolol, and ruglivose. They act by decreasing GI glucose absorption. So that's why their mechanism of action mainly what they do is they reduce the postprandial hypoglycemia, postprandial hyperglycemia. So if the PPBS is high and your FBS is normal in your regular checkup, then add a alpha glucosidase inhibitor in their treatment. So your PPBS will be reduced. It has action only on PPBS. It doesn't reduce FBS. So because of this more of high glucose in GIT, patients will have GI flatulence, abnormal liver function test, and all those things. Next is DPP4, that is dipeptidase 4 inhibitors. They act by prolonging endogenous GLP-1 action. I told you already in my first class, GLP-1's glucose enters the beta cell and undergoes further steps, and finally, with the help of gliptins, insulin is being released. Here directly we are giving this gliptins. So endogenously gliptins will be produced and they will be degraded by DPP4, dipeptidyl peptidase. But if we are giving inhibiting this, so these actions will be prolonged. So more GLP-1 means more insulin. So this GLP-1 increases insulin production and decreases glucagon production. Just remember DPP4 act by prolonging endogenous GLP-1 action. So this increased GLP-1 causes increased insulin and decreased glucagon. And the examples of this type are alogliptin, linagliptin, or gliptin, their gliptins, names saxagliptin, sitagliptin, vildagliptin, etc. And these are well tolerated drugs and they do not have hypoglycemia. But the rare disadvantages are they can sometimes have angioedema and will give some dermatological effects, etc. And in the recent trend, the second drug of choice is DPP4. Gliptins are being used as a second drug apart from metformin. First drug is metformin. Once the metformin is used, then gliptins are nowadays. Previously, we used to use more of sulfonylureas as second drug, gliclazide, glibenclamide, and all. Now also they can be used, but there are some studies like where gliptins have more use. So first primary drug is metformin. Second drug can be sulfonylureas, can be DPP4 gliptins. Other than these two, none of the other drug is secondary drug. These two are generally used first. Next is sulfonylureas, that is insulin secretagogues, act by increasing insulin, and the drugs in this class are gliclazide, glimepiride, glipizide, glibenclamide, all these things. They also have more of postprandial glucose levels will be decreased more, because again this is insulin, they act by producing insulin. So that's why soon after taking food, insulin will be more released. So PPBS will be more reduced in sulfonylureas. And if you go in particular with metformin, FBS is more reduced rather than your PPBS. FBS is more reduced in metformin, but in sulfonylureas, PPBS is more reduced. Again, disadvantages are I told you hypoglycemia and weight gain, because insulin causes weight gain. Since you are supplementing insulin, weight gain is one important complication here. Same complications are also will be there for meglitinides, that is metiglinide, natteglinide, repaglinide, which are also act by insulin secretion, and hypoglycemia, same thing, everything will, complications and action, everything is same. Next is SGL2 inhibitors, sodium glucose cotransporter 2 inhibitors. They act by increasing renal glucose excretion. So hyperglycemia is there, glucose is being absorbed by SGLT2 receptors in the kidney, the PCT, and these are blocked. So all the glucose is being excreted. And the drugs of this class are canagliflozin, dapagliflozin, empagliflozin, etc. But the complication, because of the high glucose in the urine, they can develop urinary UTI, urinary and genital tract infections, hyperkalemia. Sometimes they can go to DKA. One more thing is DKA is an important complication of SGLT2 inhibitors. Just remember this thing. DKA is an important complication. It is not seen with any other drug. As a part of treatment, DKA is not seen in any other drug. Only drug causing DKA is SGLT2 inhibitors. This is important. Next is thiazolinolidines. They act by decreasing insulin resistance and increasing glucose utilizations. Mechanism is a little bit complex. Just know the main final effect. Drugs are pioglitazone and rosiglitazone. And most disadvantages of this one is peripheral edema, weight gain, and fractures, macular edema. All these things are very complications of these drugs. Mainly peripheral edema is one thing you have to remember. Thiazolidines, peripheral edema, and going to congestive heart failure, weight gain, all these things. And this amide is pramlintide. Gastric emptying is decreased in this one, and that's why they. So this also has more of postprandial glucose levels are reduced here. This is about pramlintide. Next is GLP-1 receptor agonists. That is, they act by, that is nothing but examples of this class are albiglutide, dulaglutide, exenatide, liraglutide, lixisenatide, semaglutide, all these things. There are nothing but GLP-1 substitutes. From outside, you are giving GLP-1 like analogs, you are giving directly. So again, they act by increasing insulin and decreasing glucagon, and slow gastric emptying will be there. The main advantage of this one is weight loss, and they do not cause hypoglycemia. But they can have hypoglycemia is increased risk. Increased risk of hypoglycemia can be there. Next is insulin. Insulin acts by increasing glucose utilization. The mechanism of action of hypoglycemia with insulin is increases glucose utilization. I told you in the previous class the mechanism, decreases hepatic glucose production and other anabolic products. And we'll see about this insulin now. So these are the tabular column showing insulin analogs. There are many types of insulins: short-acting insulin, long-acting insulins, and actually 3 types are there: short-acting insulins, intermediate-acting insulins, and long-acting insulins. In the short-acting insulins, aspart, lispro, and glucagon. These will be there. These are the short-acting insulins. Intermediate-acting insulins are regular insulin and this NPH. This is the intermediate insulin, and long-acting are degludec, tritimer, and glargine. These are the long-acting insulins. This is a tabular column from Harrison as per recent guidelines, but previously the classification used to be like this. And this is the their onset. As you know, your short-acting insulin onset is very less. Within less than half an hour, 30 minutes, the insulin starts acting, and the peak comes within 1 to 1.5 hours, and the total effect lasts for 4 hours. That's it for short-acting. You see, for regular and NPH, onset is around half an hour to 1 hour, lasts for 4 hours, and effect is seen till 6 hours. And but degludec, tritimer, and all, there is nothing like peak action. Onset starts between 1 hour to 9 hours. There is no peak action for them, and the effect lasts for more than 24 hours, 12 to 24 hours, or more than 24 hours. So with long-acting insulins, degludec, tritimer, and glargine, there is no risk of hypoglycemia because there is no peak effect. At some point of time, insulin levels reaches high. There is nothing like that. So it is just basal insulin levels will be released. So the main advantage of long-acting insulin is risk of hypoglycemia is very less, but all other things can have hypoglycemia. So these are the various types of insulins. Now these insulins will be combined in a different combinations and then they will be giving some type of you might be when you are doing internship you might be reading when you are in wards testing in a diabetic patient sometimes this can be written insulin it's a human mix start 70 by 30 50 by 50 70 by 25 these type of combinations are same. So we'll be combining these two. This advantage of short acting is immediate action will be there and that but the effect lasts only for some time. If you give mix with NPH, immediate action will not be there, but the effect lasts for long time. So if you mix these two combinedly, then we have immediate effect will be there. Soon after administration, within half an hour, effect will be there, and the effect lasts for long time. Also. That's why we'll be combining these things 70 30, 70 25, 25 25 combination will be there. So this is about insulin and how we'll do this insulin administration. A short note on insulin administration I'll tell you. There are two types of insulin administration which I'm showing here is called as basal bolus regimen and the right one is called as premixed regimen or mixed combinations will give. How will you this is how this basal bolus works is we will be giving a long-acting insulin that is Detimar or Glargine or Regludec at night. That is just before sleeping. We will be giving a long-acting insulin, which will act like this all over the day. It acts like this. There are no peaks for this. I told you already. Just acts like this. And whenever you are consuming food, just before breakfast, we will be taking short-acting insulins. That is your Lispro, Aspart, Lulicin, these drugs. Before breakfast, before lunch, and before supper, that is before dinner you'll be taking this. So this I told you already the action of this is when you are giving at this point of time when you are having breakfast within half an hour the effect and there is a peak and it will come down by lunch with just 2 to 4 hours. So this basal insulin controls the fasting glucose levels whenever you are wake up in early morning glucose levels and you are consuming food and this postprandial glucose levels will be maintained by this aspart and the short acting insulin. This is called as basal, we are giving and bolus regimen. That's called as basal bolus regimen. Just to remember, basal bolus regimen is one type where you will be giving long acting insulin at bedtime and short acting insulin, ultra short acting insulin just before food 3 times. This is basal bolus regimen. One more is pre-mixed regimen. You will be mixing 2-3 types. How you will be giving is instead of long acting insulins, we'll give NPH, that is intermediate acting insulin, that is NPH, I told you already. This will be giving before breakfast and before dinner. 2 times we'll be giving. So if you see action, NPH action will be like that. It will be slow rising and the peak will be there at the time of lunch. So that the lunch part will be covered by this NPH and again by dinner time it will come down. And again if you give at dinner you will giving this and this will be there over midnight the high peak will be there and by morning the levels come down. So this NPH maintains the fasting glucose levels and the lunch hyperglycemia is also maintained by this NPH. So to prevent the breakfast and the dinner hyperglycemias, we will be giving short-acting insulins, Lispro and Aspart, before breakfast and dinner. That is about premixed insulins. Just the difference is this is basal bolus, this is premixed. Difference is NPH given 2 times daily before breakfast and dinner, and along with that we'll be giving regular insulin before breakfast and before dinner. Same time we will be giving 2 insulins at a time. So that is premixed regimen. And this is basal bolus regimen. And this figure is again nothing but basal bolus regimen only in the form of infusion. It's not like long-acting insulin. We'll be giving insulin infusion pump regularly, continuously, and then with boluses we'll be giving it. And one more thing, of all these insulins, only the regular insulin is IV. All the insulins has to be given subcutaneous form only. Only this regular insulin can be given in the form of IV. This is again important. In DK management, I told you already, IV will be giving it and it is only regular insulin. So this is about all types of insulins and different types of regimens in short. So finally, to see the treatment part, first a patient comes to diabetes, we have to individually control the glucose levels by diet and physical activity, weight loss. And first start with metformin. Metformin is a drug of choice, first drug of choice. Then reassess the HbA1c and monitor the FBS PBS levels. If it is still not in control, then add a second agent. And this second agent differs depending on the patient condition. Sometimes it can be sulfonylureas, sometimes it can be gliptins, inagliptins, saxagliptin, etc. Then you have to again HbA1c levels has to be monitored. And then if it is still not in control, we can add a third drug also. Sometimes pioglitazone, thiazolidine diones. If the PPBS is only high, you can add acarbose, meglitolol. These things can be added. So 3 drugs can be given. If still is not in control with this, then you have to go for insulin. 3 drugs are the maximum drugs that can be given for a diabetic patient. If you have more than 3, then go for better to start insulin. It requires insulin. Insulin with metformin has to be given in these patients, and then HbA1c levels and sugars has to be monitored all through life. So this is about diabetic complications and management. Yes, and in the next class